Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the 2021 Western Field Ornithologist Conference. I wanted to briefly take a moment to acknowledge that many of us in our group likely have friends or family living on the Gulf Coast and now bearing the brunt of a severe hurricane hitting that area. And so I understand that many of us have some thoughts elsewhere today. We do have an exciting program today, and I'm happy to welcome everyone back. I want to mention that Jen Hodge is our technical advisor and has helped us to set up this conference and is here during every session to help speakers and to help attendees with any problems that they might have. You can communicate with Jen via the chat and look to the chat for any announcements. I would also point out that if you have questions for the speaker, to put those in the Q&A, and then Jen will help us go through them at the end of the presentation. So I'm delighted this morning to introduce Phil Unitt, our first speaker for the day. Phil is the curator of birds and mammals at the San Diego Natural History Museum. He's published many articles and book chapters on the distribution, ecology, identification, and conservation of birds. He is the co-author with Michael Patton and Guy McCaskey of Birds of the Salton Sea. He's the author of the San Diego County Bird Atlas, and more recently is the editor and co-author of the San Diego County Mammal Atlas, a really unique and wonderful publication. Phil has served since 1986 as the editor of Western Birds, a remarkable 35-year period. In fact, Phil helped me with one of my very first scientific publications, and he is a wonderful editor and really helpful with working with authors. As a professional editor with the museum and with ornithological societies, Phil has edited and produced numerous publications on a wide variety of topics having to do with science and natural history. So I'm happy today to present Phil Unitt, who will be talking to us about the role of the San Diego Natural History Museum collections of ornithology and mammalogy in the history of Western ornithology and natural history. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you so much, John, for that kind introduction. So let me share my screen here. Let's see. Okay. Get the right one to share.
Start it from the beginning.
There we are. Okay. Do we have the right screen up for everybody now?
It looks beautiful.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for tuning in today to listen to what some people think is a dry subject, history. But think for a moment. How did we come to know what we know about birds? Collections of specimens have been fundamental to biology since the science emerged. It's easy to take bird collections for granted, yet the effort that they represent is monumental. So I'd like to tell the story of one collection of the Department of Birds and Mammals here at the San Diego Natural History Museum, which I think is a story of amazing accomplishments in spite of very humble beginnings. Each of the great collections has stories like this behind it, and I hope this one example gives you an appreciation of the human story behind those collections. I suspect that the dehumanizing of science is one of the reasons for the current plague of science illiteracy, whose ill effects are now laid bare. So let's take an hour to rehumanize science and understand the foundation that allows us to have confidence in our identifications of birds and understanding of their changing distributions. The founder of our department, indeed one of the founders of our museum, was Frank Stevens. Born in a log cabin in upstate New York in 1849, he was unable to attend school after the age of 16 because his labor was needed on the farm with so many men gone to fight in the Civil War. But he read as much as he could about natural history. At age 22, he learned taxidermy. And 2 years later, he married Elizabeth Fowler and moved to Kansas. It was there in 1874, he collected his two oldest specimens in our collection of the greater prairie chicken and the Eskimo curlew. Sorry, I don't know the story on the tip of the curlew's bill having been broken off. Stevens spent the winter of 1874, 1875 in Colorado Springs, where he was trained in better bird skinning by Charles Aiken. Stevens got a few specimens from Aiken, including an indigo bunting collected in 1869, the oldest definitively dated specimen in our collection. He called Aiken a well-known ornithologist, although Aiken was in fact a year younger than Stevens. Then Stevens set out for southwestern New Mexico, collecting birds for Aiken. But in 1876, after his horses were stolen, he decided the Apaches were too much of a threat and headed for California by ox cart. After getting ripped off by the man running the ferry across the Colorado River at Yuma, then struggling through the desert, Frank and Elizabeth made it to Campo in southeastern San Diego County, where they remained for some months. It was at Campo where Stevens made his first notable discovery in California. In March 1877, the gray vireo. He published his report of this new species for the state the next year, and the first theme linking our department's current work with our past was set. So the studies Lori Hargrove and I have done on the gray vireo actually have 144-year-old history. After Campo, Frank and Elizabeth moved to San Diego, then to Riverside, then to Los Angeles County. But in 1880, stories of bonanzas lured them back to southeastern Arizona, where they had a cabin in the Chiricahua Mountains. On the 16th of April, 1881, Frank went out to chop wood, but saw two turkeys and shot them. Hearing the shots, Elizabeth rushed out in fear that Frank had been killed. Frank thought it was a big joke on Elizabeth and tasked her with carrying the turkeys back to the cabin. One of those is now catalog number 3 in our collection. The native population of the turkey was extirpated from southeastern Arizona in the early 1900s. Stevens' specimen is among the few of it ever preserved, so it has been studied intensively, including sampling for genetic sequencing to help guide restoration of the turkey in Arizona. Though they returned to California, to San Bernardino in the summer of 1881, Frank was constantly on the move, collecting mainly for private sponsors or government agencies. In August of 1884, with botanist Cyrus Pringle, he made another trip through southeastern Arizona and across Sonora, down to the Gulf of California. Stevens was collecting for another prominent early ornithologist, William Brewster of Boston, but from this trip he retained about 25 specimens still in our collection. The leading discovery on this trip was the masked bob white, which Brewster described as a new species, naming it after Robert Ridgway instead of Frank Stevens. Shortly thereafter, Stevens himself published an account of their arduous trip, challenged both by lack of drinking water and flash floods. With the subsequent overgrazing of its limited range in Arizona and Sonora, the population of the masked bob white collapsed. It's extirpated in the wild in Arizona and probably in Sonora, were last confirmed in 2007. The population in captivity has been weakened by inbreeding. Kevin Clark, our director of bioservices here at the museum, is a leading expert on the masked bobwhite, having analyzed the many mistakes that have hobbled its restoration. Also in 1884, Stevens published on a bird whose habits were still essentially unknown, LeConte's thrasher. It is now extirpated at Cabazon and Palm Springs, where Stevens collected these specimens, but his observations on its nesting habits are still accurate, as is his advice on working in the desert. Just as Stevens described, we too found LeConte's thrasher nesting principally in cholla. All of these chollas conceal LeConte's thrasher nests. So we loop back again to our recent work. Please stay tuned for Laurie Hargrove's presentation on LeConte's thrasher this afternoon around 1:10. In 1885, America's leading mammalogist, C. Hart Merriam, persuaded Stevens to take up mammalogy as well as ornithology. And this he did eagerly. And just 2 years later, in 1887, he described a new species, the desert kangaroo rat. His original description went beyond just measurements, color patterns, and skull characteristics. He kept some of the animals in captivity and observed their behavior, including their use of the tail as a prop and disinclination to drink water. The Stevens' next move in 1887 was back to the mountains of central San Diego County. But Frank was frequently gone on collecting trips. He sold most of the specimens, retaining just a fraction for his own collection. In the winter of 1889-90, he made a grueling trip through the Anza Borrego Desert to the Coachella Valley before there was any road. In 1891, he participated in the Death Valley expedition funded by Congress and led by Merriam. In 1893 and again in 1898, he went to the San Jacinto Mountains, the first visit to the San Jacintos by any naturalist. Besides such species as Williamson sapsucker and the now extirpated lodgepole chipmunk, Stevens collected two species the later expedition missed: the common nighthawk at the southern tip of its breeding range, where it has never been found since, and the saw-whet owl, which we also found. Frank's first wife, Elizabeth, died in 1898, but later that year, he married Kate Brown, who became quite a scientist in her own right. The woman with Frank in this picture is said to be Kate, but I think it's actually Elizabeth. In any case, Frank and Kate lived in San Diego the rest of their lives. Frank had the idea of writing a book, California Mammals. In 1906, he realized this dream, though with much struggle, part of which was the result of the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, disrupting the printing industry statewide. The book was essentially self-published, and Stevens lost money on the project, though it's a milestone of California natural history. Another major expedition in which Stevens participated was the Colorado River expedition of 1910, led by Joseph Grinnell of UC Berkeley's Museum of Vertebrate Zoology. This almost ended in disaster with a wreck of the boat on the 11th of March. And I hope you can see the trays of specimens that they managed to save out there drying in the sun while Grinnell is drying out his pants. The expedition pressed on and made it to its conclusion on the 15th of May near Pilot Knob and Yuma, when this picture of the team was taken. Grinnell published the results of the Colorado River expedition in 1914, the first intensive study of that critical area. Back in San Diego, Frank and Kate became the first employees of the San Diego Society of Natural History and went to work creating a museum. They opened the first exhibits in a room in the new Hotel Cecil in 1912. Then the exposition of 1916 left buildings in Balboa Park, to which the nascent museum then moved. Research and publications were fundamental to the Stevens goals for the museum. And in 1919, Frank published the first annotated list of San Diego County's birds, followed in 1921 by lists of the mammals and the herps. But the growth of the museum and its multiple goals were starting to exceed Frank's capabilities. So in 1921, at age 72, he cut back and assumed a role as curator emeritus. In his later years, he spent much time collecting at his ranch in Mason Valley on the edge of the Anza-Borrego Desert, or as Stevens called it, La Puerta Valley, because he refused to use the name of a man like Mason who beat his wife. These collections too are still returning us value. Here we have 3 geographical variations of the round-tailed ground squirrel. The dark reddish specimen at the top represents a variation known only from Stevens specimens from La Puerta Valley. Finishing its description as a new subspecies is still on our task list. Frank Stevens left his personal collection to the San Diego Society of Natural History, the nucleus from which our collection has grown ever since. And that's his truck from which Kate said he was a reckless driver. In spite of Frank's lifetime of adventure, he was killed almost on his own doorstep, hit at age 88 by a streetcar running up Park Boulevard at Robinson Street. Don't think that this story doesn't cross my mind twice each day as I bicycle through this intersection on my way to and from the museum. Frank Stevens' legacy is also preserved in the various animals named in his honor, usually on the basis of specimens he collected. Perhaps the best known of these is Stevens' kangaroo rat, a now endangered species endemic to the inland valleys of western Riverside and northwestern San Diego counties. Alfred W. Anthony named a subspecies of the fox sparrow after Frank Stevens when Stevens told him how it was distinguished by its enormous bill. Alfred Anthony was a mining engineer and bird collector whom the museum hired as director in 1922. The fledgling museum vacillated over what staff it could afford and let him go after a short time. But Anthony had been collecting in the San Diego region since the 1890s. The picture of him with him and Frank Stevens together here was taken in 1930. Most of Anthony's early specimens are now in the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, but we have some later ones, such as this sharp-tailed sandpiper from Mission Bay, representing only the second record of this species from California. And I couldn't resist including Tom Blackman's photo here of the first sharp-tailed sandpiper for Imperial County, just a couple of years ago. Anthony owned a ship and was interested in ocean birds. He went to Guadalupe Island, 300 miles south of San Diego, 200 miles off the coast of northern Baja, and collected some of the birds like the endemic storm petrel and endemic subspecies of the ruby-crowned kinglet that are now extinct. I think his most important publication was the Raided Rookeries of Laysan, a belated echo, in which he called attention to the decimation of the albatrosses on their nesting islands and how that was reflected in their disappearance from their oceanic range off Southern and Baja California. He picked up the skull of the short-tailed albatross from a carcass washed up at Pacific Beach in San Diego in 1893. On the 26th of May, 1908, Frank Stevens was camping along the Sweetwater River in Bonita, just southeast of San Diego. Suddenly, a 15-year-old truant with a shotgun burst into his camp. Stevens greeted it with, "Hello, come in." The invitation was into a wonderland, for scattered about on 2 tables and a cot were several trays of bird and mammal specimens, the first the boy, Lawrence Huey, had ever seen. Thus was born one of the great stories of mentor and disciple in the history of our museum. But Huey already knew something of value to Stevens, where on San Diego Bay to find the black rail, a species now extirpated here. Each of them in turn published on the black rail, also sometimes called the Farallon rail in those days. Later in 1908, Huey joined Stevens for a collecting trip to the Tijuana River Valley in search of the now endangered Pacific little pocket mouse. On that trip, Stevens taught Huey how to prepare specimens. Huey never looked back and went on to a long career serving as the curator of our department for 39 years. In his early years, Huey collected mainly for Donald Dickey of Los Angeles, but kept a portion of the specimens for himself, including in 1914 2 birds new to California, the tricolored heron and red-eyed vireo. The next year, he went to San Clemente Island, and among the birds he collected were these 5 loggerhead shrikes of the endemic island subspecies. In the 1990s, with the shrike seriously endangered, Nick Mundy, working on his dissertation at UCSD, wanted to sample them for a genetic study. I winced at the concept of pulling feathers and suggested a slice of skin from the sole of the foot would be less destructive. So we tried it, and Nick got better results than he had with feathers. We published a little note on the technique, and now it is so routine in genetic studies that our publication is no longer cited. Here's Lawrence Huey on the right, taking a break from specimen preparation with Jose Gallegos, a Mexican scientist with whom Huey worked repeatedly, and Lorenzo Cook, one of the new museum's young volunteers. On many of his collecting trips, Huey was accompanied by May Canfield. She's prominent in our collection, responsible for over 2,000 specimens. The story handed down to us is that she was the first woman to drive a motor vehicle into central Baja California. In the left picture, Huey and Canfield are with Jose Gallegos along the lower Colorado River. I don't know where the other picture was taken. Huey called Canfield Aunt May, and she's variously called Huey's foster mother or adopted aunt, but their true relationship is murky. Our former librarian, Carol Barcy, told me that May Canfield forbade Huey to get married as long as she was alive. At some point, she had a health crisis that left her disabled. In the 1940 census record, she's listed as living with Huey, and her relationship is specified as mother. The one thing that's certain is that May Canfield was a pioneering woman naturalist. Here are specimens from one notable day that Huey and Canfield spent together on the outskirts of San Diego, encountering ample numbers of sage thrashers and brewer sparrows in an area now overrun with urban sprawl. Here's one of the classic pictures of Huey working in the field with the tray of just a few kangaroo rats to skin. I doubt if any contemporary mammalogist knew the kangaroo rats as well as Huey did. And here's a priceless photo with Stevens, Huey, Anthony, and Sam Harder in the field at San Felipe, northeastern Baja. I don't know a lot about Sam Harder, but he was one of Huey's disciples who contributed substantially, especially during Huey's expeditions to the lower Colorado River. Lawrence Huey is the single largest contributor to our bird and mammal collection. Not only that, he himself made the specimen cases that you see in this picture, the cases that we used for so many decades. In the fall of 1946, he documented what he called a flash invasion of the Mexican long-tongued bat, our only nectar-feeding bat. That year, many people called the museum reporting this strange bat in their garages or other buildings, and Huey verified that these were long-tongued bats, an eruption that has not been paralleled since. The kind of parallels the occurrence in California of the tropical kingbird. One of the most important areas where Huey worked was along the lower Colorado River. Stevens and Grinnell got a 3-month snapshot, but Huey went back year after year at all seasons, giving us our best understanding of the wildlife of the lower Colorado River before everything was changed forever with the building of the dams. Some species, like the beaver and the partially red-shafted population of the gilded flicker, are now extirpated. The yellow-billed cuckoo has been decimated, but is now the object of efforts at habitat restoration. Our specimens from the lower Colorado have been sampled for a genetic study. Rare birds that Huey and Harder found included some new to California, such as the chimney swift and the Cape May warbler. One of Huey's major projects was an intensive survey of Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, comprising 3 trips totaling 90 days in 1939. The pond at Baquito was one of the few sites in the US for the least grebe. Huey's study would be invaluable as a comparison with current conditions and the disruption wrought by the border wall. But Huey's greatest accomplishment was his decades of work in Baja California. All 3 of these specimens, the Sangre de Cristo subspecies of the California vole, the Valle de Trinidad subspecies of the round-tailed ground squirrel, and the San Quintin kangaroo rat, are mammals that Huey discovered and described. All 3 are relevant to studies that our current mammalogist, Scott Tremore, and his collaborators have been working on. They recently published on the precarious status of the California vole in Baja. Subspecies Grinnelli, which Huey described, survives at only 2 sites. Here's Scott and our collaborator, Annie Peralta, trapping them in the Sierra San Pedro Martyr. When Huey died in 1963, he left a monograph on the mammals of Baja California nearly completed. The following year, the museum published it, the culmination of Huey's career. Another particularly fitting memorial to Lawrence Huey is the name of the exquisite subspecies of the porwell, endemic to the lower Colorado River Valley, bestowed by Donald Dickey. It's very small and pale and even more finely patterned than the 2 subspecies of the porwell found elsewhere in California. Clinton Abbott wasn't a collector, but I consider him the Franklin Roosevelt of our museum, the leader who got us through the Great Depression and World War II. He was an ornithologist as well as an educator and administrator. Things that Stevens and Huey took for granted, like urban burrowing owls in the 1920s, were notable to an import from the East like Abbott, who foresaw their ultimate disappearance. Abbott pushed conservation on multiple fronts, from championing the concept of a state park in the Anza-Borrego Desert to chronicling the extinction of one of the birds of Guadalupe Island, the endemic species of caracara, He told the story of how he got these 3 specimens collected in 1875 by Edward Palmer, the first naturalist to visit the island. One of the greatest photos in the museum archive is this one of Abbott standing on Huey's back to get the right angle for photographing a LeConte's thrasher nest in an ocotillo. And here's Abbott documenting something that was new in 1924, urban adaptation by the orange-crowned warbler. In the ensuing century, the orange-crowned warbler has become quite the common urban bird in San Diego. But in 1924, this kind of nesting in somebody's lath house was novel. Also a key figure of the museum's golden age was board president Joseph Sefton. Besides being a prominent banker and museum supporter, Sefton was also a collector. This specimen of the white ibis from the heron roost at Sefton's estate on Point Loma is still one of just a handful for California. Sefton was particularly interested in seabirds and collected many notable specimens of them, documenting the least storm petrel farther north and the ancient murrelet farther south than they had been known previously. In Sefton's day, the white-winged scoter was still a common winter visitor on San Diego Bay, but since 1970, it has disappeared almost entirely. In 1944, Stanley Jewett, a leading ornithologist in the Pacific Northwest, who long worked for the agency that became the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, decided to sell his personal collection, amounting to nearly 13,000 specimens. Our museum put up $8,000, a remarkable investment considering that the museum was then closed to the public while occupied as a military hospital. And it would take a year after the war for us to get back on our feet. But as a result, the San Diego Natural History Museum has the largest collection of Oregon birds. Among the species of which we received an important sample from Jewett was the marbled murrelet. Our specimens have been sampled for one of the pioneering studies quantifying ratios of stable isotopes in feathers and confirmed the murrelet has had to shift from a diet of fish to less nutritious krill. Jewett also traded specimens with other collectors throughout the US, so that's how we ended up with some of our most remarkable specimens, such as this pair of the now extinct ivory-billed woodpecker. Guy McCaskey, who came to San Diego to attend college in 1962, didn't collect that many specimens, but what he did collect represented a revolution in our understanding of bird migration. His first specimen was this ruff, an Asian shorebird and the first record for California. Guy tells me that this was the last bird that Lawrence Huey ever skinned. In the next 2 years, Guy collected a whole bunch of species new to California or San Diego County on his way to revolutionizing our understanding of vagrancy. In 1964, he and Dick Banks, Huey's successor at the museum, published on these remarkable discoveries. Sorry the specimens aren't as perfect as Huey's. Guy didn't prepare them himself, and Banks had a bad habit of overstretching their necks. Some of Guy's discoveries were of birds just then starting to colonize California, the great-tailed grackle and cattle egret. The yellow-crowned night heron was collected in 1963, first for California, but didn't colonize until 2006. And yes, that neck is way too long, and then the stick broke, so the head has to be supported very delicately. The area of greatest lifelong interest to Guy has been the Salton Sea. On the 17th of August, 1974, he collected this little sandpiper that was clearly of some Asian species not expected in California. In the field, we could see it had no vestigial webbing between the toes. Guy published it as a rufous-necked sandpiper, as the alternative had never been found in North America previously. But birders were uneasy, and even a reanalysis wasn't conclusive. Finally, a genetic study gave strong evidence that it was in fact a little stint. This story is one of the great examples of the value of having a specimen that can be studied repeatedly. Dick Banks was the curator of our department from 1962 to 1966 when he went off to the Smithsonian. With a doctorate from Berkeley, he was our first curator with formal training. Banks participated in the museum's multidisciplinary Belvedere expedition to the islands of the Gulf of California, where he collected this fishing bat he's posing with in this picture. He made several trips to Cerralvo Island in the Gulf east of La Paz and described 3 new subspecies from there and published a summary of the birds. Here in San Diego County, his most important contributions were surveys of the rodents and bats of the Anza-Borrego Desert. These reports aren't published, but we have copies in our library and are critical to our understanding of the distributions of these groups of mammals. Joe Gill succeeded Banks. Joe's most important work at the museum has to be his participation in the studies that documented the thinning of the eggshells of birds, especially the brown pelican nesting along the Baja California coast, and the linkage to contamination with the pesticide DDT. In verifying this effect, comparison with eggs collected before the invention of DDT was essential. So yet again, museum specimens pay off by yielding value that their original collectors could not have imagined. Joe studied other water birds too, such as the black and American oyster catchers and their hybridization along the coast of Baja California. Birders still use his system for describing the features of hybrids. On his lunch break, Joe would go to the garbage dump, then operating in Balboa Park, and collect gulls. His specimens contributed greatly to our understanding of the plumage cycles of gulls, especially Thayer's gull. Suzanne Bond actually started at the museum as an assistant to Dick Banks, but she worked closely with Joe throughout his tenure. Joe and Suzanne collaborated on a landmark study of the merlets nesting on the islands off Southern and Baja California. We have their study to thank for our understanding of their identification. Suzanne was the ultimate master of specimen preparation and is still the model we aspire to. We're deeply grateful that in her later years, she supported and volunteered in our department, passing her skills to Scott and me. It was under Joe and Suzanne that we started receiving specimens consistently from the San Diego Zoo and SeaWorld. Remember, no animal lives forever, and it would be a shame to let these specimens, often of rare or endangered species, go to waste. Suzanne prepared these massive cassowaries. Likewise, these amazing birds of paradise. But the real value of the zoo specimens in our collection is the skeletons, of which we now have a worldwide scope. For example, our skeletons of just the dove family run to 455 specimens of 105 species, a third of the total worldwide. Before Joe and Suzanne, our collection of bird and mammal skeletons was minimal. Jill's successor, Amadeo Rea, brought many new perspectives while maintaining a core focus on taxonomic ornithology. He got his start as a Franciscan friar, training in the seminary at Mission San Luis Rey in the early 1960s. But while studying Catholic philosophy, Amadeo was also eagerly banding, collecting, and studying birds. Among his early specimens from the San Luis Rey are tricolored blackbirds, the first California specimens manifesting a severe infestation of mites of the genus Cnemidocoptes. Since then, the problem of this mite infestation has become ever more pervasive, with detrimental effects on blackbird populations, as we described in an article published 2 years ago in Western Birds. And the tricolored blackbird is now extirpated from the San Luis Rey area. Amadeo's many taxonomic works include studies of 2 threatened species, the California gnatcatcher and cactus wren. He raised the profile of the wren particularly, which the USGS has now adopted as one of its focuses of conservation. To understand the effects of environmental change, Amadeo studied not only by direct observation, but through archaeological remains and through the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples. After leaving San Luis Rey, he started his career as a high school teacher on the Gila River Indian Reservation, south of Phoenix. In his years there, he integrated completely into the community, forming close friendships with people who still knew the traditional ways. All these sources were brought together in his book, Once a River, Bird Life and Habitat Changes on the Middle Gila, an extension of his dissertation at the University of Arizona. Such an interdisciplinary study is cool today, but it was pioneering in the 1960s and 1970s. Amadeo was a founder of the discipline of ethnobiology, and his colleagues in that field recognized his many accomplishments with a Festschrift published in 2012. Amadeo was even more interested in birds' skeletons than in their external features. It gets interesting once you get their clothes off, he's fond of saying. He published many papers on zooarchaeology. The most sensational concerns a site in Peru where bones of 2 black vultures were found in an archaeological site with human skeletons. Artwork from this Moche culture depicts birds with captive people, but it took Amadeo identifying the bird skeletons and understand the drawings for the gruesome conclusion to come together. The vultures were used as instruments of torture of the human victims, then sacrificed themselves. Here are the recovered vulture bones, plus the photo of the vulture and human remains in situ together. Amadeo's interest in vultures encompassed the California condor. He had identified its bones from multiple sites around the Southwest, including several from one cave in the Grand Canyon, as mapped in this article in the museum's former publication, Environment Southwest. With this knowledge, as well as a compilation of historical records, Amadeo proposed captive breeding of the condor at a time when the concept was still highly controversial. He was way ahead of the pack in thinking not only of captive breeding, but of sites for reintroduction. These included the Grand Canyon region and the Sierra San Pedro Martyr. Amadeo planted the concept of the reintroduction into Ezequiel Oscura, who had the power and influence to make the reintroduction to Mexico happen. 40 years later, Amadeo's wild ideas are now evident to be prescient. For years, we had no skeletons of the condor in our own collection. I requested them repeatedly. And finally, in 2006, the US Fish and Wildlife Service sent us the decomposed remains of one that had been found dead in southern Utah. In a supreme irony, it was a bird that had been raised in captivity and released at the Vermilion Cliffs near the Grand Canyon. So it was Amadeo's proposal that initiated the chain of events that ultimately brought the skeleton to us. Among the episodes in the history of the museum where basic science led to a success for conservation, this has got to be among the greatest. And just in case you didn't think a condor was big, compare the bones with the corresponding bones of a turkey vulture. I had the pleasure of working with Amadeo on some projects, including this description of a new subspecies of the brown creeper from California's Central Coast, subspecies with its distinctive smoke-colored underparts. So some people wanted me to include my history with the museum as well, but I'd like to close in focusing on just one further component of the collection, the specimens we have received through Project Wildlife, San Diego's Association of Wildlife Rehabilitators and now part of the Humane Society. The birds that fail rehabilitation need not go to waste, but can make a lasting contribution to science. From Project Wildlife, we've received well over 2,000 specimens representing 271 species, some of them unexpected, notable, or valuable from the standpoint of conservation, as you can see from this list. The photo is of the first Newell's shearwater found on the North American continent, showing the diagnostic pattern of the undertail coverts, half black, half white. These specimens allow us to document urban adaptation and the establishment of exotic species such as the red-crowned parrot and the red-masked parakeet, which I now hear and see every day. They give us a window into things that are impractical or impossible to study by other means, such as the schedule of dispersal of juvenile least bitterns, which come to grief in urban settings with surprising frequency. These two black storm petrels found inland within the city of San Diego. You see they still have down on their bellies. Most likely they were disoriented by the lights of the city when they emerged from their natal burrows on Los Coronados Islands, which lie just off Tijuana. These three immature Aleutian geese were found along the coast of San Diego County within the space of 4 days, the southernmost specimens of the Aleutian cackling goose yet, and allowing us to confirm the identification of the Aleutian when it lacks the bold white neck ring of the adult. So we take pride in bringing a vibrant, active collection, which is unfortunately not the case with all the major bird collections. Last November, when Narka Moore Craig found this rufous-backed robin that had been coming to her bird bath, dead from a gruesome eye injury, she contacted me knowing that no collection in the entire state of Arizona was currently preparing birds. Thanks to Gary Rosenberg and Scott Tremore, we got the specimen to San Diego. But it's a reminder of how precarious such resources can be. So I hope I've helped deepen your appreciation for the value of museum collections and how science exists only because individual people like you and I commit ourselves to it. Thanks very much. Do we have time for any questions?
Yes, we do have a couple of questions, Phil. The first question is from John Dunn, and he asks, do you know how the English name of Stephen's whippoorwill or C.V. arizoniae?
Yes.
What is it?
The Mexican whippoorwill?
Okay. And then the second question,
Is this a trick
I
question?
don't understand the question, so I don't understand the answer. I'm sorry.
Well, is the question was Stevens the describer of or discoverer of the Mexican whippoorwill?
I guess that is what.
I'd have to look that up.
John Donne, if you can clarify your question, we'll ask it again. How was it, and who named it?
Yes. Okay, hold on.
You gotta look it up. While you're looking at that, can I go on to the next question, or
Please.
you've got it. Okay. What year did Amadeo first propose introducing condors into the Grand Canyon and San Pedro Martirolo?
Oh, it would have had to, I don't know the exact year, but it would have to be between 1985 and 1990, sometime in the late 1980s.
Okay. When will the San Diego Breeding Bird Atlas be repeated?
Oh, oh no. So the way I answer this question is when we no longer need to power our vehicles with fossil fuel.
Mm. Okay. Hopefully soon then.
Yeah, okay, trick answer to a trick question.
Okay, do you have the whippoorwill answer?
Oh, okay, I pulled out the wrong volume here, just a second.
Okay, I'm gonna ask another one then.
Okay.
Lena says, Phil, all of this is amazing and fascinating. How were and are specimens prepared in the field then and now?
Oh, yes, okay, I can do that. You take all the equipment with you, and I've prepared specimens on a clipboard in my lap that everything can be done in the field except if they need to be washed. That's a big hassle because then I use a hair blower. So that's the only thing that requires electricity, the only thing that requires a gadget. Everything else can be done with the same methods that Frank Stevens used.
Okay. How are you able to keep them intact during transport from primitive locations?
Oh, okay. So at the end of the field trip, then we bring a case with layers of ceiling tiles in it to pin them and dry them. And then on our day leaving the field, if we're in a remote site where we've gone by mule packing, then I wrap each specimen in a cone of or a tube of magazine paper and tape the ends, and then put them in a plastic bucket. We learned to pack with modules of kitty litter buckets because they fit well in the saddlebags of mules. But on the hike out, I'll carry the kitty litter bucket with the prepared specimens in my own hands. Scott doesn't like to do that for the mammals because it compresses the ears. So does that
I think that
answer the question a little bit?
fascinating. And then she also wanted to know if preservatives are used to keep them nice for so many years with little deterioration.
Yes, that's a very good question. In the good old days, they used arsenic on the inside of the skin, which we don't have access to, and I'd hate to think of what regulations would surround the use of arsenic. So currently we do not use any chemical preservatives. Once the specimens are dried, after they're stuffed and dried, and they go into the freezer for a week in case there's anything on them. Then after they come out of the freezer and go into the collection, we monitor regularly. Ideally, every 6 months, one of our volunteers will go through the collection, spot checking for any kind of insect infestation that could damage the specimens. If we suspect anything, they go into the freezer then for another week or two to kill anything. So it's the constant monitoring that is now critical to the preservation of the collection, as well as the quality of the cases. So in another year or two, we'll finally get all of our old specimens, old cases replaced with really the best ones available.
All right. There's a question here from Kathann. I live on the Central Coast. Does the museum today accept frozen bird specimens, and who is the contact? Any species or only rarer species?
Yes, we will be glad to take them frozen with the data, the date and location. What we accept, is all about context. Some things like barn owls that get hit on the road, so many times, that's a low priority. Cooper's hawks that fly into to windows so often, but contact me and we'll discuss it. That it's more important to me to keep the door open to the possibilities, because you just never know when that bird that somebody thinks is a Manx shearwater comes in and, oh, it's a Newell shearwater.
John Dunn asks, do you maintain primary responsibility for maintaining the San Diego County list?
Anybody can maintain his own list in the privacy of his own home. I have my list, and I'm sure others have their lists, and you can see what's published in the San Diego County Bird Atlas. And of course, quite a number have been added since then. And if you're questioning something, I'm eager to know what you're questioning.
Okay. I think maybe just the whole list that people refer to. Is that what he means, maybe?
I'm sorry?
Maybe he means the whole list that people use.
Yes.
Yeah, like the one I used for the San Diego Bird Festival.
Yes.
Did it originate from you originally? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Okay, I'm just cleaning up a couple more questions and then we'll finish up. Laura asks, where do most of your specimens come from these days?
So Project Wildlife is our #1 source, and we do still receive specimens from the San Diego Zoo, and but we have our research projects in which we have collected as well our studies of inland wetlands, of the San Jacinto Mountains, of Joshua Tree National Park and the Mojave National Preserve. All of those studies looking at environmental change have included a specimen collection component. So between those three, that would be over 95% of what we've added to the collection in the last 20 years.
All right, thank you so much. That's about all the questions we have time for. I'm going to turn this over to John, and he'll tell us about what's next. Thank you so much, Phil.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad so many people tuned in.
Thank you, Phil. That was a fascinating window into some really remarkable personalities and history. We'll be taking a brief break for about a half an hour and come back at 12:30 with the first of two science sessions today, moderated by Steve Rottenborn. So we'll see you all in about a half an hour.